Ina mana, ina reo, ina rauranga terma, tena koutou, tena koutou, tena koutou katoa. Ko Hema Sridhar aho, he strategic advisor aho o Koitu, the Centre for Informed Futures. It's my pleasure this evening to welcome you all for this fireside chat with Sir Peter Gluckman and distinguished Professor Paul Spoonley. So before we get underway, if I could please ask everyone to ensure they're on mute. Please feel free to turn your videos off. You can go ahead and do whatever you are planning to do for the evening. We don't need to see you. You don't want us to. And during the course of the evening, feel free to pop your questions into the chat and we'll work our way through them over the next hour or so. For those of you who don't know, Koitu is the Centre for Informed Futures. It is an independent, non-partisan think tank and research centre based out of Auckland University. So our goal is to address long-term national and global challenges arising from rapid and far-reaching social, economic, technological, and environmental change. Our name, Koitu, was gifted to us by Ngāti Whātua Ōrākei, and it means the sharp end of the spear. Namesake, Koitu aims to get to the heart of long-term issues challenging our future. And so that's what we're here to talk about today, is a very important topic on social cohesion. So thank you so much for joining us. So let me introduce our two speakers. Sir Peter Gluckman is the director of Koitu and the president of the International Science Council. He's also the former Prime Minister's chief science advisor. We've also got joining us this evening distinguished Professor Paul Spoonley, who's the core director of He Whenua Taurikura and an honorary research associate of Massey University's College of Humanities and Social Sciences. He's also an academic associate of Koitu. To get us started this evening, I'd like to hand over to Sir Peter Gluckman to give a little bit of introduction on the work that Koitu has done to date on social cohesion.
Thanks, Hema. In 2019, we were funded internationally to start to explore what was really undermining social trust and institutional trust in the democracies. And that led Paul Spoonley and myself to organize a workshop in London, which occurred immediately prior to the COVID pandemic breaking out, in which we had about 30 global scholars ranging from religious anthropologists through to terrorism experts, exploring what we meant by societal resilience, what we meant by social cohesion, and then most importantly, trying to identify the range of factors that could be involved. And that in the end, we identified collectively in quite a sophisticated process, about 65 to 70 factors that needed to be considered. And in the report, which was released called Sustaining Aotearoa New Zealand as a Cohesive Society, and I think Jill's putting the link in the website on the chat, we clustered that into about 15 distinct clusters of factors to consider, remembering that we live as individuals within collectives. And so how one individual might see the factors undermining their perceptions of a cohesive society will be different to another. And the context matters enormously. That work was slightly disrupted, to say the least, by the COVID pandemic, but we've continued through COVID to look at various aspects of it. And late last year, we reactivated a lot of the discussion, and that led to a second report called Addressing the Challenges to Social Cohesion, that looks more specifically at the New Zealand context, why the two core dimensions of trust that matter, social trust and institutional trust, are undermined in some circumstances or threatened at least. Beyond that, the international connectivity continues, working with United Nations Development Programme and UNESCO. Will be reconvening in a few weeks' time in Europe to extend this discussion more globally across the democratic societies, because this issue of effective polarization, of loss of institutional trust, and more fracturing of social trust continues to grow. And the work that we've done here has been seen by UNDP in particular and UNESCO as being a particularly useful way of framing the questions. So I'll stop there and hand over to Paul, who might want to talk about what we mean by these words.
Yes, thank you, Peter, and kia ora tata katoa, everybody. We've actually got quite a long, as New Zealand's got quite a long history with social cohesion. Government first began to think about it in 2003-04, when we had that second big wave of immigrants coming in after the changes to the immigration regulations. And I, along with some others, was contracted by MSD to prepare a cabinet paper, which went to cabinet in 2006. And prior to that, I was sent around the world, thank you, MSD, and I looked at what other countries were doing with social cohesion. There was a very particular view in Europe, which was really had a strong social justice equity lens through the EU. And then, of course, there was the community of communities that became popular in the UK. The ones that I thought were most relevant to New Zealand were the Canadians. And so in the 2006 paper, we adopted the Jensen, who's a Canadian, approach, so that there are 5 components: belonging, inclusion, participation, recognition, and legitimacy. That cabinet paper was not accepted. We put together some definitions. We put together an indicator, an evaluation piece, and we made some mistakes. But to go back, the paper really wasn't accepted because, in part, I think, governments at the time thought that social cohesion was good, so why did we need anything deliberate? The mistakes we made were that we didn't centre te tiriti in the social cohesion definition. We didn't anticipate the rise of social media. And in 2006, the global financial crisis had yet to kick in 2008. So I think that decade, at the end of that decade, 2008, 2012, the GFC, what occurred then through the second decade, particularly around 2015-16, particularly in the United States, and the politics of that, and the sort of tribalism and the polarization, and the rise of social media. By this time, New Zealand had moved to a social inclusion approach as an official policy, but of course, 2 things have changed that. One is the Royal Commission, which very deliberately put social cohesion back into the mix as part of the response to the Christchurch shootings, and of course the COVID pandemic. And we at Koi2, using Google Map data, looked at what was happening in early stages of COVID in New Zealand, and were able to demonstrate that compared with nearly every other country apart from Taiwan in particular, that there was very high level of compliance. And we would have said social cohesion. And I think looking back, we were probably a little naive. And so Peter has mentioned a couple of papers since then. And I think we've rethought what social cohesion is or should be. Just to finish off, I do think that Canadian model of belonging, inclusion, participation, recognition, and legitimacy provides a bare bones framework, but it has become much more complicated. And I think we need to rethink and explore what it is we mean and what we understand social cohesion to be in the third decade of the century. Yeah, I'll stop there.
I would add to that that definition really is a reflection of the outcomes of social cohesion. and that what Chan et al., the other Canadian group that looked at what social cohesion was from a causation point of view, what led to either the strengthening or weakening of social cohesion, was added in the definitions in the papers that we actually wrote, Paul, which was to identify that in a democracy, that there are two dimensions of trust that are fundamental to having a cohesive society. One is the trust between citizens and the institutions of governance, which are not just Parliament and the executive of Parliament, but also the institutions such as law, police, the other elite institutions, banks, insurance companies, universities, and so forth, that what we came to call either vertical or institutional trust. And then the second dimension, which is where most of the New Zealand focus had been until recently, which is on social trust. That is the ability of people who, by definition in a democracy, will have a range of identities, worldviews, and value sets, to be able to agree on how decisions are made in ways that both respect the interests of the majority and of the minority at the same time. And so it was really working off that the work we did in London and then more recently has really tried to look at the factors that might be undermining social trust, which was really a bit of the much of the focus of the Royal Commission report after Christchurch, and more recently on the areas that perhaps politicians have been less comfortable to discuss, the factors that might undermine institutional trust. And I think that what we've seen across the Western democracies is a range of factors compounded obviously by COVID, but also by the role of disinformation and misinformation in undermining the relationship between, well, undermining trust in the institutions and people that govern. Now, they're not independent, these two dimensions. Clearly, there's interaction between social and institutional trust. And so the issues become complicated in a world where the role, the behavior of our institutions can undermine trust, and equally, when trust is reduced, institutions can react in ways that make trust even more undermined. So it's a very complex story.
Thanks for that, Peter. Just, Paul, going back to your point on COVID, and given our current situation here in New Zealand with an upcoming election, what are some of the consequences of our current state with increased polarization and distrust? What is that going to do to the future of social cohesion for us in the coming weeks, months, and years?
Yeah, it's hard not to be too dramatic on this, because I think, you know, we talk about existential threats, and I think we've also discussed inside COI 2 the threats to our social democracy. And if people haven't looked at the Edelman Trust Barometer, then I would suggest that you do, because I think it sums up some of our challenges. So this is the 2023 Edelman Trust Barometer, which is a huge international survey. And what they talk about is the combination of the collapse of economic optimism, the decline in trust in government that Peter has talked about. They discovered in talking to people around the world that the media are seen as fueling distrust, and they talk about severe polarization. And it's quite interesting. They've got various rankings, and it might come as a surprise that when people in countries self-define, the most divided country by those inside that country is the Netherlands, followed by Brazil, Sweden, and France. And one of the things that came out, which I think applies here, is that people are feeling very pessimistic about the social fabric of their countries. And they've got two quotes that I wouldn't mind just reading out. The first is, The lack of civility and mutual respect is the worst I've ever seen. And around the high-income world, 65% of people responding to the Edelman survey affirmed that it was the worst they've ever seen. But the second one is that the social fabric that once held this country together has grown too weak to serve as a foundation for unity and common purpose. And again, the figure affirming that was 62%. And I think even in recent days, we've seen the way in which respect and trust are beginning to play out or not play out in terms of this election. So to riff off Peter's point, I think one of the things that you see in Edelman and one of the things that you see inside New Zealand is the relatively rapid decline in trust in core institutions, but also the lack of respect. And so there are 7 countries that are defined by Edelman. New Zealand is not one of them, by the way, by Edelman as being severely polarized and as not seeing a way back from that polarization. So Brazil, Sweden, the USA are in those 7. And I think we're all faced by the issue of how do we restore trust and how do we restore respect? And to come to the question, Hema, I look at what's happened with the local elections, where there was, in my view, disengagement. I look at the experiences of Stats New Zealand collecting census data when there was often outright hostility. And I think a barometer, to use the Edelman word, the barometer for us is going to be the next few weeks leading up to the election. And it will, I think, provide us with an example of how far that trust has declined between communities, between parties, and between government and its citizens. Peter?
Well, I think it's worth going back a bit before COVID, that, fundamental to people's sense of comfort in society is stability. And we've said we're in a period of very rapid change, be it technological, economic, social, environmental. And there's a lot of scholarly evidence that rapid change leads to increased anxiety, and increased anxiety is associated with a loss of trust. And the default position, as we quote in our most recent report, in New Zealand, there's more than 50% of people start with a distrusting default position. If we look at it in terms of what's happened in the last few years with COVID, with the way in which political discourse has occurred or not occurred over important matters, it's quite destabilizing. So we've seen that New Zealand media has a particularly low trust rating on surveys. There's been a decline in trust in the police, which might relate to the way they had to operate in COVID, in the way in which they had to handle protests in Wellington and so forth, and perhaps related to perceptions of crime. And loss of trust in the police is a good reflection of loss in trust in a number of civic institutions. Against all of that, and our second report comments on a lot of ways in which the way in which the political system has operated in the last few years, and not just only related to the current government, in the way OIAs are responded to, many other factors are responded to. There's many compounding factors that can make people skeptical of how governments respond and act. Then on top of that, the way that the digital milieu has, both in itself and in the way the political communicators have responded, has led to more and more ad hominem rather than ideological discourse, such that in the United States, for example, effective polarization is defined by the fact that it's not policies that that separate Republicans voters from Democratic voters. It's rather their view of the other side that separates them. Now, we're not that far down that path, but you can see in the way in which the discourse is going that it is at risk. I mean, many commentators are scared of how the rhetoric between the major political parties may play out over coming weeks. Now, all of that comes to make people more and more skeptical of the very system that democracy requires for a democratic large-scale society to function. So I think that if one could have a magic wand and hope that politicians might debate policy rather than people and identity, it would be very helpful. Unfortunately, I think neither the news media nor the digital milieu make that a likely outcome.
Thanks, Peter. We've got quite a few questions coming through, but one of the questions touches on your point on the disinformation and this digital environment. And I guess with ChatGPT and everything that we're hearing with generative AI and the like, what role do you think that this is going to play in what social cohesion looks like over the next 6 months to a year? And how do we strike an appropriate balance here?
Well, as you know, Hema, I've been on the road for the last 6 months, largely embedded in this discussion on how society should handle AI and large language models, et cetera, et cetera. And the word that I'm hearing most often now is the word panic. People realize that the potential of this to undermine the way in which democracies are designed to operate is very real. The problem is, of course, that it is actually very difficult to regulate. The International Science Council, and you're involved, have been asked to try and think of ways in which the non-governmental system might work with the intergovernmental system to find ways to do so. But I think we're facing a really challenge, because the challenge is there's always been disinformation. I mean, for 20,000 years, people in power have used disinformation. What's changed is the pervasiveness and the ability to spread it rapidly and with difficulty. So the issue is, how do we make societies and citizens more sensitive and able to recognize and cope with it and the things that are around it? And I think every country is now grappling with that. Every democratic country is now grappling with it. And as I said, organizations such as the United Nations Development Programme and UNESCO are now really struggling and trying to work through ways to actually address what is going to become an existential threat to to how we understand democracy.
Can I add to that? Because where I sit in He Whenua Tarekura, I see a lot of the harm and the disinformation and the hostility because we're dealing with a particular part of society. And I must confess, at times my view of how serious an issue this is gets a little distorted. It is an extremely serious issue. I've worked with governments, as you heard, since 2005 on social cohesion in various capacities. And I wonder if there aren't one or two things that we need to address more directly. One of them is that governments often do social cohesion, but in fact, social cohesion is most profound and best achieved by communities enough. So that if we think about COVID and we think about Māori and Pacifica communities, that's a very good example that, you know, in partnership, you achieve what you want to do. The second is so bottom up. I think the second is that we need to think about our political system. Peter's hinted at it, but you know, there are some interesting models out there about deliberative democracy, about participation. And the third is that while I'm most of my days I'm pessimistic about the impacts of social media and online platforms, there are some really interesting signs of new thinking in this space. And there was a conference earlier this year in San Francisco called Designing Tech for Social Cohesion. And they've established a council, which is Council on Technology and Social Cohesion. And they've identified several issues. One of them is, how can you work with platforms when many of us are deeply distrustful of the platforms because of how they operate, and the platforms in turn are distrustful of people who are critical of them. So some of the questions they asked is, what sort of regulatory systems would incentivize platforms to contribute positively to social cohesion? And there's some really interesting thinking in terms of what's called bridging algorithms that bring people together in respectful commons to discuss issues. They identified things that I think would say is important, and that is digital literacy. How do you operate in this environment? And they also have a very interesting program on what they call recommender systems. And recommenders are how you get recommended particular sites or particular online material, and how you begin to develop mediated dialogue. So I think, who's in the room on social cohesion and who's the most effective operator? Do we need to think about our fundamental political systems? And then, yes, we have a problem with social media, but I think there's some really interesting thinking about how we begin to modify some of the negative consequences and begin to build into it some of the respect and some of the things that perhaps we've lost.
One of the challenges, and there's a very good article by Ian Bremner and his colleague in Foreign Affairs this month on the problem of the different technopoles in relationship to these large language models and AI. And the point he's layering about the different kinds of regulation which will be needed from both the multilateral to the local system to try and deal with the challenges of the very different approaches that have emerged between China, the US, and arguably Europe in terms of these technologies. I spent a lot of my time in relevant discussions in recent weeks, and will be again in Europe about that next week. But I think that the more immediate question, which you alluded to earlier, Paul, and you alluded to me making a point about this, I think core to this is, how do you reinstate institutional trust? Because institutional trust is declining in the democracies, and there are different components to that. But one of the most important components of a democracy is people feeling that they have a sense of agency and impact over their own lives, which of course is what distinguishes it from a strong autocracy. And I think these new models that we employ in Koi2 experimentally of both digital and in-person bottom-up consultation leading to informing policy decision-making, as are most extensively now used in countries like Taiwan, are in fact probably the best way to give people confidence again in the decision-making processes of a democracy. I think the presumption, which is I think only partially proven in an empirical sense, is people can accept decisions that they don't agree with if they feel their voice has been heard. And I think that's where the current political dynamic does not assure people that their voice has been heard. And I think that the kinds of methodologies that Anne Barsley, Tatiana, and others are using with both digital and in-person approaches allows people to feel their voices again being heard. And I think that the future, as you suggested, a lot of this is about bottom-up empowerment, bottom-up engagement of people and the potential of using digital techniques, as is now used in Taiwan, to make people feel their voices heard, not in a yes-no simple way, but in a much more sophisticated, nuanced way, is probably important in rebuilding institutional trust. Equally, however, I think some of the cynicism that many in officialdom use, like last-minute consultations on the Friday before Christmas or something like that, are the kinds of things that undermine social cohesion. In terms of horizontal trust, again, I think local empowerment makes it more likely that social trust will emerge, because so many decisions can be made at a local level that are now made centrally, and that requires people to talk to each other.
Thank you, Peter and Paul. I'm going to go to some of our questions now, because there's quite a few in here that I think segue quite nicely from what you've both been talking about. And one of the ones here that I'm looking at asks how we can utilize positive social factors in our communities to earn back trust, or for the government and institutions to earn back trust. And is there a way in which we could use positive social factors to do this?
Well, I think there are examples around the world that, in micro examples, where that's been achieved. I mean, it may not be a good example for New Zealand, but the Iceland example of how they dealt with youth mental health and youth drug abuse issues is a good example of a wraparound community, government, local bodies, schools, communities all working together. I think we've seen in some of the iwi in New Zealand green shoots in that direction of using the community at that level to try and sustain and develop itself and build the systems. I think at the end of the day, however, unless the society disparages or discounts ad hominem attack and argue and seeks people to discuss the issues rather than discuss the messenger, I think it will fail. So I think that one of the problems we've got is that we tolerate, as a society now, seem to tolerate large levels of ad hominem attack when, in fact, we should be demanding that our politicians and decision makers and ourselves discuss the issues. And that seems to have become very hard, and not helped by the fact that our media, and we actually have we're in the planning of workshops at the moment with the mainstream media at the moment about how they'll respond to large language models, the steps they need to rebuild trust in the mainstream media, which has also fallen dramatically, particularly in New Zealand. I think there are things that can be done, but there are lots of small things rather than one singular intervention. And again, if you go back to our initial report, the fact that there are so many factors that different people perceive as being important or not important, different cohorts within our society will see as important or not, is we need to understand what matters to different groups in our community. And at the moment, we don't really explore that. I mean, it is unlikely that a recent migrant from South Asia is going to have the same view of society that somebody that living in rural Southland, for example, might have of the issues. And so we need to respect the fact that democracies are built on understanding the diversity of views within the society.
I was asked recently to write on this and how things were developing in New Zealand. And two things, really. One, the question that I posed myself and tried to answer is, what does active citizenship look like? And to be active as a citizen, what do safe spaces look like? So it obviously involved online, but it involved a lot of other types of spaces that in which people come together. And so we talked about communities of care and respect. And it came out of, this is the second point, it came out, I was chairing a government group looking at hate speech in New Zealand. And we asked various communities, various target communities, to come and talk to us about their experiences, and they were truly heartrending in terms of what some individuals and some communities experience at the moment. And so there's sort of a breakdown really of that respect, or a spike in disrespect. But the group that was really moved me were our teenagers, and the way in which their lives and their online lives as well was impacting upon them, so that it was leading to self-abuse, self-harm. We heard stories about suicide. So at one end, it was extremely grim. But what also heartened me was that those same communities are beginning to take things into their own hands. So there's a group in the South Island called Sticks and Stones, and I would really like them to produce a manifesto for what we should aim for in terms of safe online spaces for our youth. So I'm with Peter. I think there are some very helpful and energizing and hopeful initiatives that are beginning to emerge, but they don't seem to be played out nationally. And one of the questions I would raise is, when we talk about social cohesion, are we talking about New Zealand being a socially cohesive society? Are we talking about communities or parts of New Zealand regions, our cities in which we live, our towns in which we live? Is that where social cohesion should be prioritized and be an aim? Or is it really within our more intimate settings? And I think it's probably all of those, but it rather depends on what sort of question and what sort of response you're trying to achieve.
And obviously, and I agree with that, Paul. I mean, Eleanor Ostrom, the Nobel laureate, writes a lot about the institutions of self, institutions of civic life, institutions of national life, to which I think we now have to add institutions of multilateral life. And I think that the strategies and the things that affect societal resilience, which is really what we're talking about here, are different at those different scales, and they need different interventions at different levels. Now, there's some commonalities. I mean, anxiety, rapid change affect all those levels of cohesion or resilience. Technology is having a factor on all of them. The way we have our discourse is affecting all of them. And it's interesting, we talked earlier about the fact that 7 countries are identified as particularly fractured but in Finkel's paper on effective polarization in science, he highlights New Zealand as one at particular risk. So, you know, which is in Science in 2021. So I think we shouldn't be relaxed. I think we should be looking carefully at ourselves at every scale, from family through to national, and in fact, in terms of our relationships more globally, in terms of what can we do to enhance both institutional and social trust.
Thank you for that. There's a couple of questions in here that relate to what you've both just said, which is around what is the impact of New Zealand's system, particularly with our MMP and the democratic processes we have, versus alternate systems of government and some of the other countries. And as you've highlighted in the paper, is there's lots of other countries that are democratic that have similar challenges, but how are we I guess presented in these challenges next to some of in comparison to some of these other nations?
Well, I think you've got to remember, first of all, Hema, that there are really only 2 ways of organizing a large-scale society. The first is with some form of autocracy, be it an absolute monarchy, a theocracy, a dictatorship, or it's some form of democracy. But democracy, as we talk about it, is really only a 200-year-old experiment with lots of variations in what it actually means in practice. New Zealand has what I've called a shallow democracy. We have less checks and balances in our democratic system than many others. Now, you might say that's worked for us well and that we've been very, very relatively more cohesive than many societies, but also makes us more vulnerable if it goes wrong. We don't have the strong checks and balances of an upper house, of strong select committee systems, etc., etc. We have a relatively weak fourth estate and so forth. Our checks and balances are not as strong as perhaps in some other countries. And we've relied on the fact that we're small and a trusting society to actually maintain that cohesiveness despite challenges. And we've addressed some more openly than others. But I think that MMP is a particular challenge. MMP was designed in Europe in the 1950s and 60s as a centrist mechanism to try and get centrist politics. And if you look at the grand coalitions of Europe in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, you saw the centre-left and the centre-right tending to work together. But in the more recent past, probably with the advent of social media and all the other things we've talked about, we've seen the failure of those kinds of proportional representation models to bring people to the centre. They've actually pulled people apart. And so whether MMP itself pulls people apart in this world which polarizes more, or whether it can again reinforce the centre is a challenge. I mean, we're seeing, at least in the public opinion polls, that the central parties, if you like, National and Labour, are seeing a decreased proportion of the vote relative to the parties that are more, shall we say, at one end of the spectrum or the other. Now, is that just a transient phenomenon, or is that a phenomenon that in a world of digital and all the other surrounds pulls us apart rather than pulling us together? And so you get into commentary, which I'm not competent on, about to what extent will the tail wag the dog, so to speak, in political process. And I think we've seen in countries which have the most proportional systems, like, for instance, Israel, a complete failure of government as these trends play out and the centrist government falls apart.
And can I add to what Sir Peter's just said by noting that there have been some very interesting initiatives, and I'm responding to Alison's question here about how democratic we are. There have been some very interesting initiatives around the world, in some parts of Scandinavia, in parts of the UK, Canada, where the act of citizenship, to go back to the point, to the term I used earlier, has been encouraged by systems at the local level of getting voices that are often not heard into the conversations and having a conversation. And I agree entirely with Peter that it's actually feeling that you've been heard and that you've heard others that is really important in terms of a sense of, well, to use Jensen's words, belonging and participation in your democratic systems. And I would really like us to look at both the national level, but also at the local level in terms of what local participatory democracy looks like. What does active citizenship look like at that level? And I would note that, you know, when I look at local authorities like Vancouver or Toronto, the way in which they go about consulting, and I know that's an overused word and it's a word that cynics like some of us would question, but they, since the late 1980s, in the case of Vancouver, have included a variety of ethnic and faith communities, and more recently rainbow and trans communities, in public discussions in a way that's safe and in which their voice is heard. So I think there are some quite good examples around the world. We seem a little reluctant to look at the technology for what it can offer in terms of democratic participation. And I'm not sure why that is.
And that's despite the fact that the OECD in particular has put a lot of effort into thinking about these new modalities, either in person or electronically, in which to engage citizens in active participation. I'd go back to a point that we perhaps not made, but is relevant to the question that started this part of the conversation off. I think around the world, we've seen many democracies shift to become more autocratic in the last few years. Now, that may have been accelerated and has been accelerated by COVID, but it's spilled over well beyond the public safety component, and is likely to persist in a number of areas for arguably good reasons. But I think that, and Will Davis wrote a brilliant book called Nervous States about this, autocracies flourish because when people are scared, they want strong government. And so one of the features that happens, and we may be seeing this happening in that big country in the Northern Hemisphere, which is full of lawsuits at the present time, where it suits, and you only have to go back to Trump's inaugural address and how dystopian he put it, that it suits autocratic rulers to make people feel scared, even in a democracy. So there's a real iteration here between the affect of the citizens and the behavior of governments. And of course, there's also a good literature now relating belief in conspiracy theory to a lack of distrust in government and a sense of being scared or anxious. So there's some complicated dynamics in play in countries that have shown this significant autocratic shift in the last few years, and that was accelerated in some cases by COVID.
Emma, just before you ask your question, Lisa's pulled me up on the Canadian example in First Nations, and yes, that's absolutely right. The inclusion of First Nations in political process is deeply problematic. So I should have probably acknowledged that as well.
Thanks, Paula. I was going to ask you if you wanted to comment on that. There's a question here, because we've talked briefly around education, and there's a question here that says, that asks whether we've got too much focus on STEM and not enough on humanities in our school and higher education, and particularly our kids' ability to learn to discuss, listen, and empathize. And do you want to comment on that?
Yes, well, number one, I'm not sure we have a great emphasis on STEM either in our education system, but put that aside, I agree with the principle that is underlying the question. And in fact, Nina Hood, who worked with us from the Education Hub, and Jackie Bay are focused very much on this question of how do we enhance, what does the education system have to provide in terms of socio-emotional development to deal with a world in which very rapid change will be continuous. There's a body of literature about how people respond to rapid change and how the consequences of lag in the education system to adjust and deal with the kind of skill sets that are needed to survive, which, as the questioner has just pointed out, requires social-emotional skills rather than cognitive skills in which to thrive.
Yeah, I would talk about transferable skills. So, those skills that allow you, I mean, the OECD suggests that most school leavers that will leave secondary school in New Zealand this year or next will undertake about 16 to 18 different jobs. And that's not with different employers, that is different jobs. So how do you navigate around that rapidly changing landscape? And so, the traditional things that I would emphasize is problem solving, literacy of various sorts, working in teams, having good interpersonal skills and understanding or knowledge. And so that allows you to navigate this new world of work and new society, I must say. The two are not indivisible. And so, content at times becomes less important. If I was talking to a group of year 13 students, I would point out that 65% of the jobs they will do in their working life have yet to be created. I mean, we just need a very different approach to education, in my view.
There's a question here that asks about whether this, our conversation this evening is biased towards a Western perspective on social cohesion. And given, Paul, earlier today, you talked about fertility. And so what unique perspectives does New Zealand have here, given our bicultural foundation? And what could we do that might be slightly different to some other people when it comes to rebuilding?
Well, I think that's ultimately the New Zealand challenge, isn't it? How do we build a multicultural society on a bicultural underpinnings? And we haven't really had that discussion completely yet, and it's not been a particularly open discussion either. So it is the fundamental challenge. But getting back to the root of the question, democracy as we know it is effectively a Western invention. And clearly we've seen that countries outside outside the Western world, as you might define it, have struggled to accept the model of democracy as we see it. But having said that, if you go into most Indigenous societies, they have their own ways of maintaining social cohesion, and they come to the same basic points. How do you actually decide who has authority and how the rules are set and what happens to people that break the rules? And secondly, how do you have a discourse where you get agreement within the society on what to do? Now, that scales at different levels, from small Indigenous societies to the rather distinctive large Indigenous society that we have in New Zealand. But the principles are still the same, that cohesive in a society can either be imposed by an autocracy, which means you lose agency, or you have agency as individuals, in which case you need to both have ways of defining the rules of that society and the way in which decisions are made. So while the specifics are obviously different in different kinds of societies, the fundamental evolutionary dynamics are the same. Namely, societies don't work if there's not an agreement on how rules are set and behaviours are tolerated.
As I said, I was deeply embarrassed by how we constructed social cohesion back in 2006 for the cabinet paper, and my major embarrassment was around the lack of tatility. In my most recent writing, I've actually used Tau Kukatai and Aramarata's framework in terms of things like manaakitanga and whakawhanaungatanga as principles or as values that can be brought across to help us maintain, restore, improve social cohesion in New Zealand. So I think there are some conversations and some acknowledgements that we need to make in terms of acknowledging tangata whenua and some of the values that they're able to provide for the rest of us. And of course, what I'm always struck by, as I'm sure many of us are, is by the generosity of spirit of tangata whenua when it comes to these discussions and the willingness to contribute to them. And so I think it's an invitation that we should take up and we should continue to explore. We're on a journey and we've probably got a long way to go, but it is one of the things that I think has stood us in good stead in recent decades, and it's a strength of this country.
I'd agree with that. And I mean, we're seeing an increasing number of Maori scholars such as Charles Royale starting to address how that journey might continue and what are the necessary steps along that journey.
So I guess this is a really good place to to reflect on sort of some of the key areas we've talked about. And I think, Te Tiriti is an area that is certainly a strength in terms of rebuilding and strengthening cohesion and making us more resilient. We've already talked about deliberative democracy and the role that plays in rebuilding this. And I wonder, given we've got a couple of minutes left, what are some of the other priority areas where we could focus on as we look forward, and in terms of how we do build some resilience in this space?
I'm going to jump in before Sir Peter here. I was at the Diversity Awards last night here in Auckland, and I handed out the overall prize, which actually went to the city mission. And one of the things, there were a couple of things that occurred to me. One was, inside that room, we had people who were addressing all of the issues we've discussed today in the context of organizations and workplaces. And so I would really like us to profile some of the best practice that is already occurring at community and organizational level. The second thing is, we really haven't talked about the private sector, the private business sector here. And most of us work in that private sector. They need to be partners in any of this. There are some that are really good at what we've been talking about in the context of their particular organization. And what struck me last night was that the award winners weren't simply doing it in terms of their particular firm or organization. They were doing it with communities, with the people that were that worked in their organization, but they saw them as people who came from families, who came from communities. And we've really got to bring the private sector into these conversations, because I think they have a critical role to play.
I would take a slightly, I don't disagree with Paul, I just would add a dimension we've not talked about, which is, in New Zealand, we tend to be very short-term in our thinking. We don't take a long-term view. Well, that's not true. Maori take a long-term view, but as a society, we don't take a very long-term view. And yet the society we face now has a lot of fundamental challenges, from climate change to technology, to the future of our economy, to the nature of our political economy, to the dramatic changes in our demography and social structures that Paul knows far more about than I do. And all of those are coming down the pike at an unprecedented speed. And I think if we don't start to have honest conversations, we've just brushed over the word tetiriti, and yet different people in New Zealand have different understandings of what that word means. And if we don't actually have a consensus on what we're trying to achieve, we will continue to have division. I mean, if the same word is used to mean different things by different people, you can't have a discussion. And so I think we need to focus on every modality and every forum on trying to get to a discussion of ideas rather than a discussion of people. Now, that may be very ambitious, but that's what we're about, being ambitious.
Well, I think it's useful to be ambitious. We've got, there's 93 people here. Hopefully, at the end of this, they leave with some level of ambition, and they could go away and think about some of these challenges and think about what in their, either individually or in their communities or in their organizations, what role did they play in rebuilding some trust, rebuilding as cohesion in whatever part that they play in this. On that note, I would like to thank Peter and Paul for this first fireside chat on social cohesion. It was certainly quite in-depth, and we've covered a lot of ground, and I think we've answered as many of these questions as we possibly can. If there's any outstanding, feel free to email through to us, and we'll try and get through to it in due course. But thank you, everyone, for your time this evening. It's our pleasure to have you here joining us for this, and have a good evening. Good night.